Welcome to Boarding Fundamentals. I'm Jenny Florison and we are up to Section 3, the care and protection of students. You will want to work through assessment BF3 while we're doing this webinar, and we begin with talking about our duty of care. We have a duty of care towards the students we are engaged in working with, and that is we need to care for and protect the students and respond to any risk of harm. That might be in our environment or in their home environment, anywhere. We can become aware maybe that a student could possibly have experienced abuse in two different ways. Can you think what those two different ways might be? The first way is if we're seeing signs or indicators of abuse. These are well-known indicators, and we might be seeing signs of them that are leading us to form a reasonable belief that this student has gone through neglect or abuse. The other way is to be told by someone, and we call that a disclosure. So, secondly then, we need to know how to respond. Now, we should really understand how first we became aware and the two different ways lead us to respond in two different ways. We might become aware by forming a belief or being told, as we just said. The second thing we need to understand is, what is the law in our state? Am I mandated to report this abuse if I suspect it? And how should I respond? What is your correct procedure in the residence in which you work? And how are you to report the behaviour or the concern? You must follow your law for your state, and that would be described in your procedure as well. When we form a reasonable belief that a child may have been harmed, there's several steps involved in forming that belief. The first step would be, you may see a sign or an indicator, and you could write it down and then continue to observe. If you see other indicators and you document them as well, you may be beginning to form a reasonable belief, but you might wish to discuss that with someone else, perhaps the head of boarding or a senior that you work with. If you feel that's necessary, we're not disclosing anything confidential. We're just discussing what we're seeing and checking with somebody else if what we're seeing is a reasonable belief. We may also want to try and provide an opportunity for the student to know that they have a safe place where they could talk about it, make a disclosure, and that means being available but not investigating. We mustn't in any way start to put the idea in their head that we think they may have been abused. If we do eventually form a belief, then we need to take the next step. The other way we have to know how to respond is if a student has disclosed to us that they have been abused, or somebody else has told us that they think a child has been abused. How do you respond if a student comes to you and tells you about abuse? What are the key things that you need to do? Think about that for a moment. All the parts to how you're going to respond. First thing, of course, is to really listen to them. Stop everything, believe them, show you believe them, give them empathy, acknowledge that it's been taken some strength and bravery to come up and tell somebody, and that it must have really been upsetting and hurtful to them. At the same time, we must listen but not investigate. We don't start asking the student questions or putting anything into their minds. While we're doing that, we can be assessing the urgency. What risks are around? Is there any ongoing risk? And what we can do about that risk. Then tell the student that you must report this. You're going to need to report it to get them help and get anybody else help as well. You would then, after you've finished listening to the student, you can document details as clearly as you can as soon as possible without interrupting the flow of the student talking, and then make a report following the law and your policy. So that will describe to you whether you're going to make a report to your head of boarding or to the department involved in your state. It's important that you follow strictly the guidelines that you've been given in your training and in your state or territory's law. Now, occasionally you may in some way come across a past student who's now an adult, or an adult member of the children's families, or even a co-worker who may make a disclosure to you about childhood abuse. How would you respond in that instance? Think about it for a moment. If an adult makes a disclosure to you, again, it's vital that we stay calm and listen carefully. Be patient and empathetic, and tell them that you believe in them and you would like to help them. Let them know that you're there for them, but don't pressure them to talk or to continue in any way. Just offer them assistance in maybe seeking help with their well-being if they would like some help or some professional support, counselling if they need it, and support them in identifying their options for doing that and for reporting if they wish to report. Listen to their decision as they come to that. It could take a while. It may be a very difficult decision for them whether to report or not to report. And you could also document their decision at the end. Now, for students in boarding, there can sometimes be a risk of harm when they're home on holidays, and that could be going home or while they're at home. What are some of the risks that could happen to a student being away from the residence and being at home? Some of the risks could be purely not having their basic needs met. The environment may not be, or the home may not be meeting their basic needs. There may be a failure of necessary medical care for them. There could be exposure to domestic violence or psychological harm from the behaviour of a parent or a caregiver. There could, of course, be the risk of physical or sexual abuse, and that may include relatives, visitors, not just parents. And there may be a risk of harm while they're actually travelling home. So these risks are all things that we need to be alert to as we're working with students, welcoming them back after the holidays, even sending them home before the holidays. Let's take a look now at the child protection legislation we have in Australia. The aim of this legislation is, of course, to protect children and young people who are at risk of significant harm. And under the legislation that we have around Australia, there are certain people who are called mandatory reporters who must, by law, report any awareness of child abuse to the police or child protection department. Each state or territory in Australia has a list, and those, unfortunately, all the laws are different and all the lists of mandatory reporters are different for every state. Some of those states include boarding supervisors as mandatory reporters, but not all states. So you need to be aware of what your state's law is. Just remember that mandatory reporters, if you're a mandatory reporter, you do not have to be able to prove that the student has been abused. It's not up to you, but you just have to have reasonable grounds to believe and report you've observed some kind of behaviour or injuries, or someone has told you something in the form of a disclosure. Someone else might provide reliable information, or the student might actually tell you that themselves. In some states, as I said, boarding staff are mandated notifiers. In some others, they are not. Even if your state does not mandate you to report, that doesn't mean you won't report or you don't have to. You still may want to report to the department. They will still investigate it, and the student should then get the help and care that they need if it is substantiated. Because we still have a duty of care towards our students, even if we aren't mandated reporters in our state. So the important thing is to follow the law in your state, to know your law and know who is mandated and what it says about who to report to and how to report. Your workplace policy should also line up with this law in your state, so you should be able to follow your workplace policy as well. I'm just going to go through state by state. We'll start with Northern Territory because they have a very simple version of the law up there. And in the Territory, under this 2007 Act, the Territory mandates that every person in the Northern Territory has the legal responsibility to report child abuse and neglect, and cases where children have been or are likely to be a victim of a sexual offence. In the Territory, they have to report to Territory Families Department, and there's a child abuse hotline there that can be used. So any person with reasonable grounds to believe a child is being harmed or offended against sexually, then they are mandated to report this to the department. About Western Australia. In Western Australia, we've had a recent law in 2015 where boarding supervisors were not in the mandated list of reporters up until 2015. Then we got a new act in 2015 called the Legislation Amendment and Repeal Act, where boarding supervisors were actually added into the list. But since then we've had another change. In 2021 we got a new act, which was the Children and Community Services Amendment Act for 2021, because there was a belief that other people should also be included in this mandatory reporters list, and that includes all the people in this list, and they're rolling it out over several years so as not to have it all happen in the 1 year. So in 2022, ministers of religion were added to the list. In 2023, by November this year, there will be assessors, departmental officers, out-of-home care workers. They'll all be added into the list, and next year psychologists, school counsellors and early childhood workers will be added into the mandatory reporting list, and in 2025 youth justice workers as well. What about South Australia? Under Section 30 of the Children and Young People Safety Act 2017 in South Australia, a mandated notifier is required by law to notify the Department for Child Protection, and in South Australia they have a specific mandated reporters notifiers list, and that includes the usual medical practitioners, nurses, police officers, but they've also got in there pharmacists, dentists, psychologists, community corrections officers, ministers of religion, person who is an employee or volunteer in an organisation formed for religious or spiritual purposes, and teachers employed as such in a school. And then they also have employee of or volunteer in an organisation that provides health, welfare, education, sporting or recreational, childcare or residential services for children or young people. And so under that list, boarding supervisors will be mandated to report child abuse, and that can be done in South Australia by reporting to families.sa.gov.au. The online reporting system is only for mandated notifiers, and you won't be able to report if you aren't. New South Wales mandatory reporting list are people who deliver these services wholly or partly as part of their professional work: healthcare, welfare, education, children's services, residential services and law enforcement. Now, specifically under each of those lists, there is not mentioned boarding supervisors, but education includes teachers, counsellors, principals, and then children's services includes home-based carers. So it's a tricky area, the New South Wales law, and if you need to discuss that further, it'd be wise to talk to us about that one. In Victoria, Children, Youth and Families Act 2005, you must make a report to Child Protection if in the course of your duty in your office, your form of belief, and that includes teachers, school principals, but no listed boarding supervisors. But it does say any person who believes on reasonable grounds that a child needs protection can make a report. The thing is that Victoria then decided in 2014 to add another offence. So they said that any adult, it is an offence not to disclose child sexual abuse. So any adult who holds a reasonable belief that sexual offence has been committed in Victoria against a child is required to disclose that information. So it's not just professionals who work with children, it's everyone. So under the failure to disclose offence, you are mandated reporters in Victoria. Queensland is a little bit similar. Initially in the 99 Child Protection Act, certain professionals in the list, but boarding supervisors are not in that list. So under that law, you are not mandated. But then the Queensland has a second law called the Queensland Education General Provisions Act of 2006. So under that act, if you work in a school, you have to report to your principal or board. So if you're in a boarding school, you are a mandated reporter and you have to report to your principal or board. However, if you work in an organisation that is not a school, then you are not mandated under that law. However, in 2020, Queensland added 2 more laws to their criminal code. The Child Sexual Offences Reform and Other Legislation Amendment Act, and there's 2 parts to it: failure to protect children from sexual offence and failure to report belief of child sexual offence committed in relation to a child. So under that law, it is an offence for you not to report it in Queensland. So any adult in Queensland is now mandated since July 2021. You all have the responsibility to report sexual offences against children to police. We began this section by talking about our duty of care to the students that we have in our programs. What is actually duty of care, and who has a duty of care to the students in our residences? Duty of care is a legal obligation that requires a person to adhere to a standard of reasonable care because they have a position that involves looking after someone else, in our case, other people's children. So this duty of care requires not only that we protect young people from known hazards, but also we protect them from harm that could possibly or foreseeably arise. and against we may be able to take some preventative measures to prevent that harm from occurring. So that means our duty of care involves a care for and protection of young people. It also involves foreseeing risk and managing any risk to a young person. Now, duty of care, you can't actually find a law called the duty of care law. Duty of care comes under common law in our country, and it involves a concept of negligence, where if a person hasn't appeared to have kept a good duty of care, then somebody might claim that they've been negligent. Now, if a person does suffer injury because of some perceived negligence of you or another person, then this common law has set a precedent that they could be compensated for the loss or damage that they've suffered. But in order to have a successful negligence claim, you must be able to prove that the person was negligent in 4 different ways. Can you think of what some of those ways might be? What would you have to prove? Firstly, that you did owe the duty of care, or the duty of care was owed to that person. Secondly, that a reasonable standard of care was not observed. Thirdly, the lack of care by that person was an actual cause of the injury, could have been prevented otherwise, and that the risk of injury was foreseeable and it was significant. So it could have been foreseen and avoided or prevented. So the question then is, what is a reasonable standard of care? How do we know what is reasonable? Well, it is that degree of care that any other reasonable person or organisation would have provided under the circumstances. So we have to think about other boarding staff around Australia, other organisations caring for children around Australia. What is the reasonable standard of care that they would have applied in this situation? And then we need to think, were we up at that standard of care? Also, what is our expected standard of care in our organisation? What do our policies and procedures expect of us? They would state a reasonable standard of care in certain situations. So that means if you're aware of the possibility or of any risky behaviour, or children even planning something that's risky, then we have a duty to intervene. As part of our duty of care, we do need to intervene and endeavour to prevent that risky behaviour. Now, where courts have found a breach of duty of care, called negligence, it's often in the situation because the adult's been aware of the possibility of some danger but not done anything about it. We can give you a couple of examples of that. In our notes we talk about the flagpole case where at a school in Australia there was a sad event occurred and the principal of the school died of a heart attack overnight. The next day the school came together and were unable to immediately swing into normal work and duties, so they called a staff meeting and they left out on duty to care for the students in the playground a lesser number of staff on duty than they normally would have in their normal standard of care. While they were having their meeting, some boys stirred each other up to climb the flagpole, and a 15-year-old boy was at the top of the flagpole when it collapsed, and the large truck at the top actually injured the boy very seriously. Now, when the parents took the school to court for negligence, the court actually found that the school had failed to provide the proper expected level of supervision. They also said that they should have ensured the flagpole was padlocked and have a rule about it that was well known to young people, that it couldn't be used without the authority of a teacher, that sort of thing. But the main part was that they hadn't provided proper supervision, the normal expected standard of supervision in their school. So you might ask, well, what about children? They're always doing things that are risky. They've got in a way, students should be allowed to take some risks in their life as part of the learning process. And this concept's called the dignity of risk. So young people have a right, or anybody has a right really, to take some risks to learn something new as part of the learning process. So say young people are trying to learn a new skill like jumping on a trampoline or riding a bicycle. There is some risk involved, but the benefits outweigh the risk because of their growth, their independence, their self-esteem. So then what is the balance between our duty of care on one hand and the dignity of risk that students should be allowed to learn and grow from taking some risks? Well, there is a balance that we need to try and achieve, and that is we've got to allow young people some risks to grow in independence, but at the same time ensuring they're safe, that the risk is not too high that they're taking, because the safety of that young person always comes first. We don't expect them to come to our care and then be killed because they took such a high risk. So taking some risks is permissible, but it depends on the level of that risk. So that's where the balance comes in. You might say, well, what if they deliberately step outside the rules and get harmed because they deliberately broke the rules? This involves a concept called contributory negligence. And contributory negligence is when the person has knowingly done something that's put themselves at risk. So they've broken the rules, or they've deliberately done something that was quite risky. It means when they've done that and they've ignored the rules or boundaries put in place, the people caring for them have a decreased liability because the young person stepped outside the rules and contributed to their own harm. In the notes again, there's an example of this occurring in a boarding house where the young girls were deciding it would be fun to slide on the wet floor of the bathroom, so they got some more shampoo or soap and got it all over the floor, and then were having a great time sliding on the wet floor, even though, as you can imagine, they could think there could be a bit of risk involved in this. All was going well until one of the girls slid across the wet floor but was holding a sharp pencil in her hand and somehow managed to run into something, and the pencil went into her eye and she had a serious eye injury. So you can wonder whether the staff were on hand, whether they knew about it, how much duty of care was happening. But the student, in a way, was not taking reasonable care for their own safety, and that contributed to the harm that they suffered. So then the tricky part of that is how much do they know and understand of the risk involved? Did they knowingly do this thing, understanding all the risks? Because we all know children have kids' brains, not adults' brains, and just sometimes don't think ahead. So how much do they understand, or how much have they been warned? Did they know about the rules? The second thing we need to remember is that we have a duty to intervene. If we know about the potential of something being harmful, we have that duty to intervene and prevent that risky behaviour. Now you might say, well, how can we determine that word knowingly? Because there are some young people who may not understand or consider the risks, particularly younger children may not understand, don't think through the consequences of their actions, or a young person who may have a condition or a psychotic illness or be going through an episode of something, or even peer pressure where they just aren't able to comprehend the concept of the risk that they're putting themselves at. Hopefully we can have forewarning of this and intervene and educate them before harm is happening. Now, we have the duty of care in our boarding houses to care for and protect and prevent risk, prevent harm to our students. But sometimes, of course, we're not with the students 24/7. We hand over our students to the school each day of the week, or to other agencies or people who are outside of our boarding, who are not employed in boarding. Temporarily, usually, we refer them out to, some organisations. You can probably think of when we do refer our students or let them go to other people or organisations. Can you think of some situations when that happens in your residence? What can you think of? When they go to the doctor, when they go off to a counselling session, when they go to a music lesson, when they leave the property and go to their football training, or even leaving the property and going to some part-time work, which has been approved by their parents. All these times we're actually referring that student out to somebody else's care. Well, that's what it appears to be. But in actual fact, we still have the duty of care for that student. So we need to do some checks to make sure that they are still going to be safe. It's still our duty of care to be responsible to make sure. So what sorts of things do we need to check on when they're going out to somebody else's care? The first thing is that person actually qualified to do that job? Particularly if it's a high-risk activity, do they have the proper qualifications and training to look after a student in that high-risk activity, like swimming lessons or surfing at the beach or horse riding, something like that? The second one, of course, is do they have clearance? Are they safe to work with children? Is there any known record or any problem why they may not have that? The third thing, of course, is that we would not allow them to go anywhere where their parents haven't authorised or that the residence management is unaware of. So we must make sure we have authorisation from both those places. And the last one then, of course, is that we still need to do our due diligence on the organisation or group or person that we're taking the students to. If at all we know of any kind of risk amongst that organisation or with that person, then we need to check to ensure that the student is going to be safe when they go with them. We can't ever close a blind eye to any rumour of risk or any stories of harm occurring to a young person from that place. So it is still up to us. We do still have the duty of care. That concept in question 11 is called non-delegable duty of care. So our duty of care is non-delegable. It is a duty of care that cannot be given over to another. Even if somebody else is providing a service for you, for your young people, that doesn't remove the duty of care from the boarding residents. We must always ensure their safety. There's a couple of examples of this in the notes. One is of a TAFE in New South Wales that was training students to be Jillaroos. They were going to the Dabo Jillaroo school, and the TAFE had organised for the young people to have horse riding lessons by a horse riding lesson provider. And sadly, an 18-year-old girl was killed by her when her horse bolted. And this was a while ago, but when the claim of negligence came up, the TAFE was actually the ones who had the duty of care, and they were the ones who were charged with negligence because they hadn't done their due diligence on the horse riding provider themselves, and it was found to be some untrained horses that they were using, or horses that they hadn't had trained to a sufficient level, that caused this student's death. Another one is swimming lessons in the UK. a 10-year-old girl drowned at a swimming lesson, and although she was revived, she had brain injury from then on. And in the court case in 2013, it was found that the swimming instructor hadn't paid sufficient attention, but the school was charged with negligence because they hadn't ensured that the quality of the swimming instruction organisation was of a sufficient standard. So they were the ones, the school had the duty of care, so they were the ones that were negligent. This means that any time we are giving over our students to another organisation or person, we have to do our due diligence. And that's when we must do these risk assessments on the organisation themselves, on the person who's doing the training or whatever. We need to do a risk assessment on them, and that means we do a diligent and careful and thorough investigation into the person or group that we are handing them over to. Now, this risk assessment has to be done by somebody who's competent. They need to have knowledge, skills, experience and training to be able to do a correct risk assessment and put in place things which are going to mitigate the risk for the young people. Otherwise, the activity shouldn't be going ahead. So it can't just be any new boarding supervisor who's got a bit of time on their hands who can then go and do the risk assessment. It needs to be somebody competent. In boarding, as student supervisors, our main role is to be effective in our monitoring of students in order to be able to maintain a good environment and ensure they are safe and learning and growing. This is, of course, achieved by active supervision, moving around at all times, being where the students are, being alert and vigilant. Why do we need this good monitoring? Think about it for a moment. What do we hope to achieve by monitoring students? Are we just sort of spying on them the whole time? Are we just trying to catch them out? No, we actually have a purpose in protecting them, ensuring their safety and their welfare. We're alert to issues that we can anticipate and avoid. We can intervene if there's any unsafe behaviour or young people are sick or hurt in any way. Of course, there's also the idea that we are to be a positive support and guidance to young people as they grow. We're contributing to their learning and their growth. And this is only achieved, of course, by relationships, by building relationship, by being with young people, by listening to them and having relationships that they can trust. So what is active supervision? What are the ways that we achieve active supervision? Moving around all areas, actively engaging with students, being in unexpected places at unexpected times. And then we can be there to take prompt action, and harm can be avoided because we're there, we're watching over them, we're guiding young people. They're not left unsupervised. To be able to effectively monitor and work with all the students in our care, you might be thinking, well, what is the best ratio to have? How many staff should we have on duty for this many students or that many students? How many is enough to provide a good duty of care? That's the actual answer. The ratio of boarders to supervisors should be enough to ensure you can provide a satisfactory duty of care, because ratios are not mandated by law in Australia, nor are there any standards that actually state a ratio. So standards are not regulated at all in the boarding industry. That's because there are a lot of different factors that affect what ratios will be best in any given situation. So you can think of some of those factors Perhaps you're thinking, what time of day? Several different times of day we could do with more or less staff members on to be able to effectively work with the students. Can you think of other factors that would affect what ratio we would need in our boarding? So time of day, and then of course what's going on at that time of day, what activity type and where is it going on. So if it's just homework time at the boarding house, you may not need as many staff on for that number of students as if you're going out to a place where there's a lot more possible hazards or risks. Then of course your students' ages, their needs and their independence will vary your ratios. And then it comes down to the staff experience as well. Are your staff new or experienced and qualified? And that will also vary the ratio you need to be able to provide a good duty of care. Now, there is one document in Australia that we've found that actually dares to talk about the ratio that they feel is needed, and that's this article here called A Position Paper on Boarding Schools, and it's by the Queensland Indigenous Education Consultative Council. They wrote in this paper quite a few years ago now, but they felt that the student house parent ratio for Indigenous students needs to be about 8 to 10 to 1, rather than the 25 to 1 ratio on which most boarding schools operate. And they deem that to be because of the extra special care and interventions needed to successfully transition the Indigenous students into boarding from a home background or a remote community that may not be familiar with the culture of boarding. Now you might be thinking, well, that's very well, but that's not a standard, it's not a law, it's not a compulsory thing, it's just a suggestion. And so we look at the standard, the boarding standard, and in Australia, Section 3.6 in our boarding standard does address ratios, but it just says this: requirements relating to boarder care and supervision shall include, 3.6 Part B, a risk management process used to determine what ratios of trained staff to boarders for all circumstances. So they're talking about trained staff firstly, and then they're also talking about what circumstances. So you need to be able to list all the different times or activities that are going on, different circumstances, and then the residents needs to do their own risk management process to determine what ratio they feel is best for those different activities. So it might be homework time is one activity, going to the beach on a Saturday afternoon or a shopping centre, getting the students up in the morning or at night after bedtime. There's a lot of different sort of times and activities that you need to determine what ratio will work best for your residents. Going on to another topic now, and that's related because when we're transporting students, there are many issues involved in providing a good duty of care. Can you think of the 3 different areas in transporting students that we need to be alert to? One is, of course, the vehicle itself, and how we are able to check on whether and ensure that the vehicle itself is safe. The second one would be the driver of the vehicle, so ensuring that the driver's behaviour is well managed. And the third one is managing student behaviour. So let's go through those quickly. Transport issues to do with vehicle safety. Firstly, we should do a risk assessment on whatever journeys we're doing, and some of these journeys are repetitive, so we can do one risk assessment and just update it each time. Most residences would like people to do a pre-start check on the vehicle before they get in it and go. That's to maintain that it's ensure that it's maintained and roadworthy, that it's licensed and insured. You've got everything you need: fuel, spare, jack, first aid kit, communication of some sort. Some people are even thinking about putting speed sensors on buses to make sure staff can't overstep the speed limit. And then, of course, there's other factors like the route and the conditions. What's the road conditions like, and the weather as you're travelling. So the second issue is the managing driver behaviour. And of course we need to know that the driver is licensed, that they're familiar with the vehicle, what is their skill level and experience with that vehicle and with those conditions, and that they are sure to be travelling safely or driving safely and driving lawfully, abiding by all the road rules. The other factor, of course, is what is the driver's personal fatigue level, and also what are the distractions in the vehicle as they're driving. That can be a risk factor as well. The third one, of course, was the student behaviour. How are we going to manage student behaviour to make sure that they are safe as we're transporting them? The first big issue really is deciding what staff-student ratio can we provide a good duty of care. So is the driver able to keep the students' behaviour good and safe on the bus, or do you need another staff member for that many students? Making sure you've done your roll call and you know where your students are and who you have or haven't got. Ensuring that you don't move off until the seat belts are all on, and then managing their movement, their behaviour, and minimising any boredom by having planned rest stops, that sort of thing. So there's some of the issues to think about in keeping students safe when you're transporting them. Let's think now about other emergency situations that might occur in boarding. In Australia, students have been killed by or been at risk from all of those different events at school or in boarding. Bushfires, flooding, conditions like pre-existing health conditions like asthma, motor vehicle accidents, suicides, out on excursions, even down to lightning strikes. There's been students harmed in these different crises. And when Mr. Brooks, who wrote this article about reviewing outdoor education fatalities, he said that he found most of these incidents were preventable. He said there was an element in each of them, usually, where inattention, distraction, forgetting things, fatigue and stress led to an error of judgment on the adult's behalf or the child's behalf that led to the harm that was caused. So, of course, we don't want to be having that happen on our watch. So we do need to be alert and aware of how we can respond in any of these types of crises. So you've probably got an emergency procedures folder or file where you've got the critical incident policies and procedures, and these should be known, given to the staff members during induction, visible to everybody, because we just can't think that this will never happen to us. Thinking about illness and medical treatment of students, what are some of the important considerations we need when we're administering medication to students? Have a think about it for a minute. How does your residence manage medications for students? What are the guidelines there? Of course, first of all, we need to make sure that we have the parental permission to give this medication, that there's been no allergies recorded, that the child doesn't have any particular conditions that we're not aware of, and that any medications brought into the residence have been handed over, and that we are able to store the medications securely, and that staff will administer it correctly. And that means going through the child's recent history to make sure they haven't had medication given within a certain amount of time. When was the last time they received it? Have they been having it regularly? And then the 5 rights of caring for a student while they're receiving medication. We need to be aware of those 5 rights. We'll have a look at that in a minute. And the written record is always going to be kept, checked, handed over in a file, and if a student has a particular condition, we need to have those emergency management plans for children with particular conditions. So before administering the medication, we do those 3 things: check for conditions or allergies, check for permissions, and check their recent history. Look at their chart or their recent history on the medications file. Secondly, during the administering of the medications, some residents are wanting to ensure safety and a good record by making sure that the medicines are administered in front of a particular CCTV camera or at a particular time or with another second staff member with you. And that can make things difficult, but the 5 rights as you administer the medication is: have you got the right person, the right drug, the right dose, the right time, and the right route that it's been given in, or the right way that it's been given. At the end of the medication, do we stop and just check and watch the student and document or sign a date that the medication's been given, and then monitor them for a certain amount of time if necessary? There's a sample of a medication administration form here that's from the Queensland Department of Education, and you could have a look at that. There's samples on our website, and compare it with the way that you administer medication and keep your records. These forms are 1 per student. Some residences still record all the medication of all the students on 1 form instead of 1 per student, but that can create problems when you need to take that form for that student with you on the way to hospital or something like that. And the 4th part was just knowing when you're giving medication, knowing the young people who have the conditions and what are the emergency management plans or action plans for those particular conditions, if it's anaphylaxis or diabetes, or if it's a heart condition or perhaps epilepsy. Some of those things we need to be aware of. These students' names should be visible for all staff, preferably with photographs, and taken with you whenever you go away from the residence or that student goes away, so that they become known to all staff. And if something happens, every staff member immediately knows what the plan is for that student. So think about when you did your last first aid refresher, and did you go through some training in how to use an EpiPen? If a student's having a severe allergic reaction, those students need to have a management plan. We're going to think about some of the high-risk activities that the student might be involved in boarding. Of course, these high-risk activities do need to have a plan to minimise the risk, so that we know it's a high risk, but we do everything to minimise the risk in these activities and to manage any risk. So that means using a risk assessment. And these can be undertaken on objects and substances, not just activities, or a person can have a risk assessment done on them, or a location or a process. And so those of you who do the risk assessments will understand the 5 steps in the process. You can actually get templates for these on your phones, a school risk assessment template checklist on your phone, or you can use templates like these. They're readily available and they're very valuable. So it covers a lot of details of where you're going, the travel arrangements, the number, the names, the students, any conditions, the staff, their experience, the qualifications, any risks or hazards, what the weather's going to be like, what measures you're taking to manage the potential harm. For example, knowing the students' swimming abilities, any students with specific issues like health conditions and those who are on emergency management plans. So what is the benefit of doing a risk assessment? You can think of it straight away. It makes you evaluate the risk and minimise the risk. So put into place some things that will cause you to evaluate all the risks, minimise the risks, to plan to avoid harm. And you do that by checking if you've got a good staff to student ratio, have your staff got qualifications, experience in that activity or in the place and the way that you're going there. It will help you to check your policies and make sure you've got all the right equipment, any emergency equipment needed, that sort of thing. It's always good to make sure you give instructions and reminders to students, even if they've done this thing before, and then particularly knowing which students might have special needs and emergency management plans, and you may have to adjust the activities for those people in particular. Once you've done all that on your risk assessment, then that risk assessment is a valuable document because it gives you evidence that you planned properly and you took all reasonable precautions to keep students safe. Of course, if you're going to take a student away on an unusual or high-risk activity, usually the residence ensures that they've got informed consent, where a person gives their consent to something after finding out all the information about that activity or procedure or whatever's going to happen, so that they've got a good understanding of the benefits and the risks. In boarding, of course, there's a few different times when we need this kind of informed consent from parents in particular. Can you think of what those occasions might be? Yes, you need to make sure you've got informed consent for any medical procedure or a medical or physical intervention. Also for any high-risk activities, particularly any excursions away from the property and definitely anything overnight. So then we come to question 14, which is a scenario, and I'm going to give you time to stop and think through that as you read it. Read through the scenario and be prepared to answer the 3 different sections. Thinking back on what we've just covered prior to this, we're going to talk about the issues involved in transport in this scenario, the issues involved in referring our students to another organisation for their care and safety, and the third one is the issues around keeping students safe where medication is concerned. So you might be thinking of some of the issues involved in the travel situation in this scenario. They're going away, you're driving the students, presumably in a residence bus or vehicle, which is a journey of 240 kilometres, including some unpaved hilly track sections. So you're driving them there, and there's 10 students. So straight away, do you think in your risk assessment of the journey, do you think you need to analyse what sort of a ratio of staff to students you'll need to manage their behaviour and to ensure they are safe? Other points you need to think of are things like, checking your vehicle's roadworthy, your driver is competent and licensed and experienced, that you've checked the weather conditions currently, you've got all the equipment you need, like first aid kits, medications, water, communication device, like is there going to be phone service, or will you need to take some sort of a satellite phone or radio? Is your vehicle insured? What are the seatbelts like? And, as I said, what kind of ratio do you need? Is 1 to 10 okay for this journey? You do have a couple of students who've got conditions, but they're also leaders, so you'd need to do a bit of a risk assessment on that. Now let's think about the second part, where you're referring your students or handing them over to this other organisation called Camping Australia, and they're going to be doing some high-risk activities with your students. You're not staying on, you're not one of the supervisors, you're leaving the students there. So this is where you need to do your due diligence and ensure that everything possible has been checked to ensure that they are going to be safe. So you need to communicate with the organisation, you need to check on certain things. What would you be checking on? Do they do a risk analysis? Have they had their activities and grounds checked for risks? What are their staff qualifications like? Particularly in the area of working with children. Do they have insurances? Do they have a record of good, safe service delivery? What are their staff ratios like? Do they have experienced staff? Particularly with your students who do have those two conditions, allergic to peanuts and ADHD. Then also, what sort of arrangements have they got for bad weather? And also, how do they brief the students? So to ensure that the students are going to do the right thing and keep themselves safe, how do they do their safety briefings? Then, of course, what's their medication procedure and how we're going to hand over our medications and emergency management plans to them? What's their communication like? Their phone reception? What about their food safety program? So are the people doing the food aware of, the peanut allergy, how they're going to ensure there's no contamination in any of the foods that they serve to your student Michael? And lastly, you'd want to view the program, wouldn't you? So there's no surprises there. You know that there's nothing that's going to cause undue risk to your students. And then, of course, you've got to do the third section about medical safety. How would you be wanting to ensure that you can keep your students safe medically while they're away on this trip? So what things would you be looking at here? You'd probably firstly want to be aware of the two students with the conditions, check that they've got risk assessments and emergency plans for these students. You'd want to hand over all your EMPs to them and their medications. You'd want to know that Camping Australia has a good medication administration procedure, wouldn't you? And when you hand over the medication and the EpiPen, you'd want to ensure that it's labelled, checked, packed, that it's got instructions, they've got extra for emergencies. What about the qualification of their staff? Who does their first aid or medical, medication supervision, that sort of thing? What are their qualifications and experience? And then you'd also want to know about their phone reception and how they're going to manage an emergency communication-wise. As you have handed over the care of your students, you would have handed over their medications and their records, and also get that documentation back at the end. So you'd want them to know that you'll be looking to see documented evidence of the medications being given while you've been away. And you would of course identify to them the students who need these plans, emergency plans. So that's quite an in-depth scenario question there. Please attend to the detail of it, because that's what we're looking for, all the details of how we can keep our students safe in that referral situation. Thinking about, a crisis event that could occur in boarding or while they're away on this camp or anything like that, what are 9 things that the boarding residents and you particularly as a supervisor can do to be prepared for crisis events? How can we prepare ourselves and be well prepared so that these things won't happen? Firstly, one of the ways is to know your emergency procedures. Make sure you've got copies at hand in the residence. You know any signals for fire evacuation signal or a lockdown signal, those kind of things. You're aware of these procedures. Secondly, do you understand and know your role in response to a crisis? What is it you have to do if there is a crisis? And what will the emergency management team do? Do you have one? And who does the risk assessments in your residence? The third one is knowing how to be able to keep track of your students during a crisis. How is your current role of students and staff and visitors also? How are you keeping a record that is keeping it very up to date? Would you know where and how to access that record of up-to-date student attendance? How often is it updated? When is it updated, in the day or on the weekend? And do you have to rely on power to get that current student roll, or can you access it in hard copy? So some people are going on to online student rolls like on Reach and things like that. How are you going to access that if you have to leave the property to do an evacuation? If you can't access the iPad that it's done on, what are you going to do then? That sort of thing. Another point we want to make sure of is that you've got emergency numbers that are current on your lists and they're available to everybody in the residence to quickly be able to grab those numbers and be assured that they're up to date. What about your parent details? How current and up to date are they? If you need to contact a parent urgently because a student's been injured or killed, you want to do that before the news gets out in any other way. So you've got to have current and up to date parent details as well. How's your equipment situation? Is it available for emergencies? Do you have things like torches, first aid kits, EpiPens, asthma puffers quickly available, not in some faraway locked off area? Do you know where they all are? And if you're going to the beach particularly, do you have some kind of flotation or rescue device on a rope, thing that you can use in an emergency? How often have you done your evacuation drill for a fire and your lockdown drill? If you haven't, for instance, an armed intruder on the property, how do you go into lockdown? What is your drill? Have you practiced it this term or at least this year? And is it documented that you've practiced that and had your drills on these two areas? It's very wise to keep all of these logged in a journal or evacuation and lockdown drill log, so that you can show that you have done these things recently and that students and staff are all aware and been through the drill. So if you're thinking we haven't done one this year, then it's really your responsibility to bring that up and bring that to attention and try and activate that this term you have a fire evacuation drill and a lockdown drill. After you do those drills, it's always good to have a review of how you went. And if you feel that something was lacking, there was a deficit in the procedure, it didn't work too well, or students didn't treat it seriously enough, give management feedback and recommend for some improvements. We do cover this in Assessment 3.3 if you're going on to do the whole of the Cert 4, not just the boarding fundamentals. You'll encounter this Assessment 3.3 where we ask you to give some recommendations to update a couple of policies or procedures in your residence. The next part of this, to be prepared for crisis events, is also being ensured that your staff training is current. Where are you up to personally? First aid, your fire wardens, have they all done their recent refreshers? And have you been through those drills that are necessary to be able to respond right in an emergency? The last part of this is knowing your communication policy too. If there's an emergency going on, you may need to lock down the students' devices so that they aren't the ones that are telling people about the emergency, but it's coming through the right official channels and to the right people first. Thinking about all the different things that can cause an emergency in the boarding area. It's wise to think about your emergency management plan. What state is your plan in? How recent is it? Has it been reviewed recently? Do you even have an emergency management plan? So that is how to manage when the emergency is actually happening. So how are you getting prepared? What preparation's been done for any of these emergencies? What is your residents doing to prevent these emergencies from occurring in the first place? What are staff expected to do in response to an emergency of all these different types? And then what is the residents' plan for recovery after the emergency is over? So you might want to think about that, think of where it's kept, have you looked at it recently, and do you have an emergency management team? This team is usually responsible for developing the plan in the first place, and they should also ensure that any new staff members are inducted into this plan, that they're familiar with the plan, and that they can actually, as a team, implement the procedures so that your residence is prepared for the emergencies, have got any procedures that you can rehearse or drill. It's done frequently or as often as needed, and that they manage the response to the emergency during and after and coordinate the recovery. So, ideally, we want to keep things safe as possible, particularly our buildings and our grounds, so that these any emergencies to do with buildings and grounds will not occur. So what are 4 important ways that we can check for the safety of our buildings and grounds? Think about what is being done to maintain your property and keep it safe. The first aspect is that every staff member has to be responsible. If they identify a hazard, that they respond to it immediately. So that's everybody's responsibility to keep the buildings and the grounds safe by responding to hazards. The other way is that you have regular inspections by your maintenance staff or your head of boarding team, that there are regular inspections around the property, and that you also get in those specific safety areas checked by qualified professionals such as your electrical systems, fire alarms, fire equipment, those things. And then also most residences will be having an annual safety audit where they do a check around the buildings. They have a large checklist that they would go through the buildings, the grounds, and your equipment as well. So a test and tag program, that sort of thing. At the back of all this, of course, is whether or not your policies are up to date and available to the staff, emergency policies. Next thing we want to think about is how we are keeping our dangerous products. How are we keeping them safe, storing them, and also handling them? What are some of the good practices around storage and handling of dangerous products? So the first thing is that we need to identify the dangerous products that we're goods or hazardous substances that we're dealing with. So these need to be identified in a chemical register. And what else do you need to do around that? Can you think of it? Need to make sure that they are stored safely and that there's a risk control procedure or process that goes beside that to ensure that things are stored safely, that cupboards are locked, that sort of thing. And that in with those hazardous substances, you've got the safety information that has to go with it. So that's those material safety data sheets there stored with the dangerous goods. Another area is that we are training our staff and giving personal protective equipment and training in the use of that if we are using any hazardous substances, and that there is correct signage displayed around the residence or on those cupboards, that sort of thing. Can you think of a dangerous product that you have or use in the residence, and where are they stored? It could be cleaning chemicals, pool chemicals, things to do with maintenance such as glues, paints, solvents. There could be general grounds type things that you need to maintain your grounds, like your fuel or your dangerous chemicals for spraying and that sort of thing, and also gas and fuel storage around the property. So when you've listed all the different ways that you can maintain these safely, on that list of 4 items, you need to go back now and have a look at each one and say, well, how well do we do the safe storage with correct signs and all identified in the chemical register? How well are we using the risk controls and procedures followed? And give yourself a score on each of those points from 1 to 4. So just stop now, take a minute to evaluate it. You might need to actually go and find your locked storage area, check if it's current and up to date, where the MSDS sheets are, is it logged, are the signs relevant, and give yourselves that score out of 1 to 4. Another way that we can ensure that our students are safe in boarding as much as possible is the security of our residents. So what security features can you describe that are in your residence that would help students to feel safe, to keep safe, and help parents to feel confident that their students are safe? Can you mention a few of those now? Think what does keep your students safe in your residence? What security features do you have? Here's a list, and if you can go down that list and then beside each one tick which ones you have. So do you have perimeter fencing, movement sensor lighting outside and inside? Do you have security mesh on your doors and windows? What are the alarms or the doors? Are they alarmed into student areas? Do you have keyless entry or some other way of sort of maintaining these safe and locked? Duress alarms are another security feature that some residences, particularly those with high-risk students, may have duress alarms or phones that they can press, or alarms under a counter if they can press if they need help. What about closed circuit TV? Can you review those? Do they help parents to feel like your students are safe? And one of the main ways is actually having staff living in the grounds or on the premises, and particularly having people who are on duty sleeping over in the premises with the students in the student areas, like having a staff sleepover flat or having staff living on the site of the property. Don't forget to tick the ones that you have. Now, access is a really big issue in safety of students. Free access, of course, should not be permitted to student areas, and that even includes allowing parents free access. We used to do that in the past. It was quite common, but it's not permitted anymore, because who knows if those parents are safe around other people's children. The residence and grounds have to be reserved for student use and must be protected from access by just any general public. And their sleeping areas particularly must be for the exclusive use of students. We can't have parents coming in and sleeping in the accommodation, that sort of thing. And one way to ensure the best standard in this access area is that everyone knows that it is their concern. So access is everyone's concern. If you're out and about and you see somebody on the property that you know is not a student or staff member, then what do? Do you go and approach them? Everybody takes it seriously, even the students. We've been onto properties, boarding properties, and we've had immediately people, students even, coming up to us and just saying, "Excuse me, may I ask who you wish to see or what your purpose is here," that sort of thing. So how do you deal with a person who might come onto the property, or you notice who's onto the property? They're unknown to you, they're visiting the place, and you're not sure who they are. What will you do in response? The first part, A, is if they appear safe to approach, so they don't look like they're at any serious risk. What steps do you take then in your procedure when you see an unknown visitor? If they appear safe to approach, then approach and just ask their purpose. This should be everyone's job in residence. And then you don't just say, "Oh, okay, off you go." You accompany them to sign in at the relevant office, because every visitor should be signed in. And if they have to go into a student area, you may need to ask to see their working with children's card, or you must accompany them. You just can't leave them unattended. We should always be aware if there's any special access arrangements for any of our students, and that should be on their application form, like they're not allowed to be accessed by this parent or that relative. Now the second part of this is what do we do if there's an unknown visitor and they appear unsafe to approach? So we should have a different approach here now. They appear unsafe, what are we going to do? Most people would say, alert somebody. Who's on your list to alert, and who first? Are you going to call police, your security, your head of boarding? Who is on your procedure to call first? And if they appear unsafe to approach, you don't want them to get to students or near students. So what is the way that you go into lockdown to manage students' safety? You can't just afford them to let them wander or stay around and wait while the police arrive. You do need to get students into safety, so you should be able to give a signal, which is a specific lockdown signal. Check your policy about who can do that. Can you do it? And how is it done? What is the signal that you give so that all the students and staff on the property know that they have to go into lockdown? Right, another area of keeping students safe, of course, is their supervision at night time. So how does your residence do this? How do you ensure that students are safe at night time? There's quite a few options, of course. We've seen all of these. Sleepover staff in the residence is a security feature at night time, or having staff on call. It's not quite as secure as having them in the residence. Some residences even have active night duty, and those people on active night duty do actual regular bed checks. This could be if you have a student group who is more high risk, or young people who aren't used to living in having restraints and regulations to follow. So they would do bed checks, maybe a few times in the night, do patrols, that sort of things. There are boarding residences in Australia where this is necessary. The other options are to have door alarms and locks. Of course, fences and lock gates will give you extra security at night, and security staff may be on patrol, and you might have CCTV as well. So I wonder what your residence security features are for night time. Occasionally you might have a missing student. Students can go missing for a lot of different reasons, and it may not even be deliberate. But what do you think is your procedure? Think for a moment of what steps would you go through. Have you talked about this procedure recently? Have you looked it through or done a drill? Would all your staff do the same thing, or is it generally pretty vague? So you need a good missing student procedure. So we'll talk about steps in that, but one of the ways you can prepare for this is to make sure that you've got a tracking form, so that on the tracking form you can actually list all the steps in the procedure. The benefits of having an AWOL student tracking form is that all staff can see and know the steps they have to take. It can be handed over. Once it's filled out, it can be handed over to the next roster that comes on if the student hasn't been found. And it becomes an important document. It's a log. It goes into the log of critical incidents. And it's a record which could even become a legal document if something has gone wrong. So they're the benefits of having this student tracking form. Here's a sample of one that we've seen and used. And in this case, the actions aren't written down in order in the column. You write them in as you take them, but some residences think it's better to have the steps actually written in there. Then the staff member doesn't have to take time writing them down, they just follow them. Step number 1, confirm that the student is missing. I started doing that at what time and what was the result. So your procedure might begin with that, confirm that they're missing. How would you confirm? What are the steps that you would confirm that student is actually missing? You might ask around amongst friends, other students, staff, and you might also be thinking, what is this student's risk level? What do you know about this student? Is it a common event, or are they at a high risk about something? While you're trying to ascertain if they are actually missing, you should begin the AWOL documenting. So write down when you first started to notice they were missing and what you did first. So you asked the friends, you asked the students, you asked the staff, or you put a notice over the PA. Second would be to check the sign-out book or your sign-out reach system or the list that's kept to make sure that they haven't just been signed out by their parents. You might also want to check the school if they've actually come back from school that day. At the same time, it may be time to initiate a search. Search your common areas, their room, their friends' rooms, the grounds. May even need to look on CCTV to see if they did come in that front door after school or had been out to the dining room at breakfast time or something. You could also try to phone them. This is a good idea, particularly if you can get a friend to phone them, or you may be able to call or text. If you can call, you can dial 1831 and it shows you your number up as an unknown number. That'll mask your number and they may pick up. But if they won't, then send them a text because they're more likely to respond to a text. And then the next step, of course, might be to notify your head of boarding or principal. If you've done all those steps there to make sure that they actually are missing and haven't turned up yet, then it's time to notify your head of boarding or your principal, who will then take over and probably do the next two steps of contacting parents and contacting police. And all of these steps should be listed in your missing student document, the log that you're keeping it all journaled in. When they're found, of course, you finish your documentation and you store that record away in a log so that every time a student goes missing, there's a record kept that can be reviewed later. How does that compare with your procedure? I hope it's something similar. The next section we're looking at is online bullying. And one of the things that we need to talk about here is what is online bullying, or when is it bullying? Students may be responding that they're being bullied, but you might need to actually ask them, what does that mean? What does that mean for you? Sometimes other young people can be rude or mean, and these aren't necessarily bullying. You know, when someone says or does something that's intentionally hurtful, but they only do it once or maybe twice, that's just meanness. But if something's intentionally hurtful and they keep on doing it, even when the person tells them to stop it or show that they're upset, that becomes bullying. So saying something unintentionally hurtful or a bit rude just once is not really bullying. So you can have a good conversation with students about this. How do we resolve the situation if a student has been bullied? What would an adult's response look like? What do you think we need to do first? How do we go about dealing with this? Well, usually it's good for the adult to give the person who's been bullied some empathy, but don't overreact, and also don't make them feel like they're being punished. Reassure them that we can sort this out. Don't necessarily disconnect them from their devices to make them feel safe. Offer them support, offer them counselling, and try and give them some strategies to empower them in staying safe on their devices. So one of those is to immediately keep the evidence. If they've been bullied on their phone or on their iPad, make sure they keep the evidence, not just delete it. And then show them that we're going on to deal with the abusers and the bystanders by ensuring that there may be some consequences, there may be some education, and there should be some sort of restorative process between the two parties. Online bullying, if it's severe, can be reported, of course, to the platform providers as well, or to the police. The final question in this assessment, BF3, is question 28, which is another scenario. Let's read this scenario through and then come back to talk about how we're going to provide support to Lena, how we're going to manage the bullies who have been causing harm. We want to try and bring some change into those bullies and build in some empathy into them so that they won't continue to be bullies. We've also got a group of other young people who are the bystanders who've become involved in this bullying situation as well. So think about it for a minute. How are we going to provide support for Lena, manage the bullies and manage the bystanders. Have a go at filling in those sections, and then we'll have a look together. One of the things, particularly for Lena, is that she needs to have some strategies, so encourage her that we can develop some strategies so that we can feel safe again online. And one of them is don't respond at all. That'll only make it worse. Make sure you save the evidence, and then you can delete, block and report. Always when you're reporting, tell someone you trust who can give you support and help. Might be your house parent, a teacher or a parent. They can also tell the police if necessary, especially if it's been an anonymous, threatening kind of bullying. It can be a criminal offence. So the important parts to how to talk to Lena, we covered a little while ago in how to manage online bullying. Another good part of this is that with the bullies and the bystanders, it's always good to hear their stories individually and to check the facts of that. There may be some particular one or two young people who are the instigators, and the others might be fairly innocent but still bystanders. So individually talk with them, hear their stories and check the facts, and then endeavour to have a restorative approach. Rather than just saying, here's your consequence, we're taking your phone off you for a month, talk to them and say, what can you do to make this better now? Or how can you fix it? What can you do to make this right for Lena, particularly? And then if they can talk about that, then you can prepare them to come together with her and offer the apology, however she would like it, that sort of thing. They also need consequences, of course, so they might have their device removed. It might be in your policy even. Another consequence is to ensure that they do apologise to the victim. You've probably all got safe technology agreements, which they would have had to read and sign at the start of the year or when they first applied to come into boarding. So it'd be a good idea to get it out again now. Ask them to read it together with you and then re-sign it if they're ready to commit to that. Notifying parents is another consequence that can be pretty significant. And I always think that some education sessions of education, particularly if it's current and valuable, something that will engage them, is really important because, you know, students can then learn to get a bit of empathy towards students who they've been bullying. There are some really good YouTube videos or movie type places that you can access videos. One of these is called Ryan's Story, of a young boy in America who was bullied quite badly through his school and online, and he ended up committing suicide at the age of about 12 or 13, I think. Another resource is the Safety Commissioner website. There are videos on there called Toasted TV, and there's some one called How to Be a Bullying Preventer, and I think My Friend is Hurting, different topics like that. So it's always valuable to try and educate the child as part of their consequence. You can go ahead and complete that assessment now, and it'd be great we look forward to receiving it when you've finished all the parts of assessment BF3.